Well, good morning. Welcome to Wilderness number 6. Today we have a story that is not the one we usually tell in church. It's not the one that is often in our Bible story set. And yet it has to do with one of the greatest men of faith. Have you ever been rejected by somebody? Have you ever been a person who just gets put down? You feel like you're trying to do things right, and then it just doesn't turn out right. For some reason, everything goes wrong. And it isn't that you ever intended that or that you ever thought that. It's just somehow everything messes up and life turns into one big disaster. Well, that's kind of what the story's about. And so we want to talk a little bit today about this wilderness that we have when there's rejection, when there's things that happen that we didn't want, and how do we deal with that? The story is about Abraham and Sarah, still at this time, Abram and Sarai. It's before God had changed his name. And they had a promise already that God was going to bless them, that God would give them the land where they had traveled to, that God was going to make them a great nation, and that there was going to be a number of children. There were going to be many descendants, stars of the heavens, sand on the seashore, and what a huge promise this is, especially back in this time when family was everything. The only difficulty was they had no children, and so that made it really hard to understand this. Abraham had moved from Ur. He had come all the way across. He had come all the way to the land of Canaan, and now he's still trying to follow God and do exactly what God says. He was 75 years old when God made the first promise to him. And as time goes by, it gets a little bit more difficult each time to understand and to believe that, yeah, I'm going to be a great nation when I don't even have one child. And on top of that, it seems as if Sarah's never going to have a child.
Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And she went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarah said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant's in your power. Do to her as you please. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her.
Well, they had tried to think of how to help God with this. And this is often where we get in trouble. It's when we try to help God with his promises. And so they had thought of Eliezer, and no, he's not the right one. And Sarah comes up with the idea of her handmaid, Hagar. And why don't you go into my handmaid, Hagar, and you'll have a child for me. And so that way they would be able to fulfill the promise. Well, Hagar is probably a servant. She is, I don't know whether she's a slave or not, and there's all kinds of definitions of that. We know Hagar is cared for. She has a place to live. She appears to be a single woman. And so at this time, you just didn't have many opportunities as a single woman. She is an Egyptian. She is a servant or a handmaiden to Sarai. And she is there to do whatever her mistress wants. And so that's what happens this time, is Sarai comes up with this plan and says, why don't you do this? Well, it's not Abraham's plan, first of all, but he goes along with it. And sure enough, Hagar gets pregnant. and Hagar has a son. Well, the plan works. This is great. Don't you love it when things come together? Except for it doesn't always work. And it doesn't work when you have one woman having a child for the promise of another woman. Because by this time, Hagar gets a little bit like she's the one who should be the queen of the house. And she looks down with contempt on her mistress who is over her. She looks with contempt on Sarah. I can do what you can't do. And so that creates friction between them. It causes Sarai not to treat her right. It says that she treated her harshly. Well, I don't know what that means exactly. Does that mean that, she fussed at her some way, she was verbally abusive to her, or was it more than that? And I don't think we can know. What we do know about Sarai is that she's a woman. That doesn't mean she's a difficult woman, and that doesn't mean that she is a person who would be mean, vindictive, and yet when you get jealous, anything can happen. And so you can see as she gets jealous, she gets a little bit more intense in her treatment of Hagar, and perhaps it just goes too far. Hagar runs away. Hagar says, I can't take this anymore. And she runs away and she goes to a well. And so she's going to be taken care of. Now, the place where they live is in the wilderness, and that's why the story. And that's why we want to look at that this morning. And so she goes for refuge in the wilderness to get away from Sarai, who is not treating her right. What we do know in this story is also that Hagar then, when she becomes jealous, she begins to blame Abram. This is all your fault. May God judge between us. And it really wasn't Abram's idea. It wasn't Abram who wanted to do this. It was Sarai who was kind of trying to make this promise happen. And so Abram says, I don't have anything to do with this. This is up to you. This is what you did. So you can do whatever you want to with your handmaid. And that's when she starts to treat her with disrespect. That's when she starts to be harsh toward her. And that is what causes her to eventually run away. And so as she runs away into the wilderness, it's important to understand that she is trying to get away from this harsh treatment. She is not especially being rebellious. She is not trying to go against her mistress, but she is trying to protect herself. And as she runs away, she finds a place where there's a well. And so she comes to the well and she doesn't know what to do. What else is she going to do? Here's a woman alone out in the wilderness. How is she ever going to take care of herself? And on top of that, she's pregnant. And how are you ever supposed to take care of yourself when you're pregnant and alone in a wilderness in a strange land? Because she's from Egypt. Egypt is a long ways away. All of the people that she knows are been gone a long time. So she really doesn't have anyone else there with her.
Genesis 16:7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant. You shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.
Well, an angel finds her there. She's by the well. And the angel basically asks her, what are you doing here? She says, I'm running away from Sarai, my mistress, and of course, the angel understands and knows about the situation. But as the angel is trying to deal with this, he tells her, he says, you need to go back. You're pregnant. I want you to go back, and you're going to have a son, and you're going to name him Ishmael. And then he begins to tell him about what her son's going to be like. He's going to be like a wild man, and he's not going to get along with people, and other people are not going to get along with him. But he tells her to go back and to have her child. Well, he's sending her back to a very difficult situation. Here they are in a situation where, she's not being treated right. And after all, they think she might be carrying the child of promise. It hasn't really been seen yet. And so I can understand how they might be upset about this whole situation as well. But as you see what's happening in all of this, the important thing is to realize that God sees her, and that's what the angel comes to tell her. That God has seen your situation, and you're to go back, and you're to have a son. And here's what your son's going to be like. And so basically he says it's going to be okay. Well, that's kind of good news and bad news. Your son's going to be someone who's not going to have an easy time in life. And yet when you begin to look at where you are now, you're going to survive. It's going to be all right. And so you're going to be able to have this son, and God does see you. Well, she's Egyptian. It's not her God. But maybe in the time she spent with Abram and Sarai, she has been able to see God, believe in this promise. After all, she's part of it. At least she thinks that. And so as we look at what's happening to her, she feels like she is definitely a part of this promise. And now God has confirmed that God is able to see her in this situation.
Genesis 16:13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham.
And so Hagar calls God the God who sees. And maybe it's her first encounter with God. She has been around people of faith, and they didn't maybe act like they should act. And that is what happens sometimes. But now it's her encounter with God. And so she says, he's a God who sees. He's seen me in my situation. He's seen where I am. And she's coming to faith in God. Well, she doesn't have the same promise as Abraham. The promise wasn't made to her, and the promise won't be made to her son, that all nations will be blessed through her, because her son is not the son of promise. But that does not mean that God does not deal with and help other people. And it may even be that the closer we are in proximity to other people, the more God is able to use them, and the more they are able to come to their own terms with God, even when sometimes our actions have been regrettable, and we maybe didn't do what we were supposed to do, and we put them in a difficult situation. And here she is out in this wilderness and having to deal with all of this. And so it seems like such a difficult time for her, and yet it's the time when she comes to God. And she is running away from them and comes to God and says, all right, he's a God who sees, and he sees me. And what an incredible thing for her to realize this, that the God of Abraham is also perhaps her God as well, even though she's Egyptian. She's not under the promise, but that God is there and God protects her as well. And so maybe just in the people around us that we associate with, and that we would not see God in their life very much, maybe that's where God is able to reach them and touch them. And we would think it would be because of our great example, right? We make disciples. They follow as we follow, and everything works wonderful. And not always, because we mess up and we make life messy. Abraham is 86 years old when Ishmael was born. That's 11 years after the promise. It's been 11 years waiting for this. And so no wonder about year 10, Sarai says, well, what's going on? How is this going to happen? I think I've got an idea. And as we look at this, it's still going to be another 13 years before Isaac is born. And so she's going to go back and she's going to live with them for another 13 years as she has what she thinks is a child of promise. Well, he is a child of promise, just not Abraham's promise, because God made her own promise that he would be a great nation, that there would be a multitude. And God does see her. God does deal with her. God does help her. And I think that's one of the most important things, is that we can find God even in the middle of difficult situations, even when people are difficult, and even when Christian people mistreat us and things are hard for us. We are able to find God then. And it's not that we get justice or fairness or equality or anything else. It is that we are able to find God then, and she comes to the faith and the realization that God is the one who sees. He sees me in my situation. He sees me in my condition. And so he is the one who's able to deal with my situation. She goes back in that kind of faith and trust to live in a very difficult situation for 13 years until Isaac is born. Well, there's special complications when Isaac is born.
Genesis 21:8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abram made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, Cast out the slave woman with her son, for this son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba.
Well, we see that Ishmael is about 13 by the time that Isaac is born. When Isaac has been weaned, they throw a party. Well, what does that mean in terms of years? And so it looks like it's between 3 to 5 years when a child was weaned. It took a little bit longer in those days. And so Isaac is, 15, 16, 17, 18, something along those lines. And so he's gotten a lot older, but they can see how boys are and what they do, and sometimes they tease each other. And so Sarah sees a situation she does not like. She sees Ishmael teasing or laughing, as it says here, at her son. Well, laughing, that's all there is to it. Well, no, that's not all there is to it. There's a lot more than that. But he's laughing at her son, and it seems as if from other scriptures we also learn that maybe a little bit of tormenting is going on, a little bit of persecution is going on. And that's just one of the things that boys do that we're able to see. And it's not a good situation, it's not right, but he's a teenager. And you know what teenagers are like. All of us have been teenagers at some point, and we did things that maybe weren't so good. And so this whole story is about things that weren't so good. And Sarai gets upset once again. She says, my child is not going to grow up like this. He is not going to grow up being tormented by someone else. And so she tells Abraham, you need to make her leave. Well, Abraham doesn't want her to leave. After all, they've seen that, God said something about her being in a promise as well. Maybe not Abraham's promise. He's going to come through Isaac, but at the same time, it's more, this is his son. How can he just turn his back on his son? And he knows that there's nothing out there now. If I send her out there, there's not another well she's going to run to. Last time she knew where the well was and ran to the well, and now there's not another well. But God tells Abraham, listen to your wife. I'm going to make him a nation because he's your son. And so God gives Ishmael a blessing because he is a child of Abraham. He's not the promised child of Abraham, but he is a child of Abraham. And so he is going to give him a blessing, and he is going to make of him a great nation. And so maybe that's what makes Abram a little bit easier about sending her out. So he gets up the next morning and is able to give her the water and able to give her the food that she needs, the bread that she needs, and he sends her away. That's got to be one of the most difficult things. And this jealousy that you see happening with Sarah, we find it so destructive. Why doesn't God do something about this? Why can't God fix jealousy in people? Why can't he cause us to not want something? Why can't he cause people to not make fun and torment others? Why can't he make Ishmael a better son? Why can't... And the whole situation, the fact is that God didn't fix it all, but that God uses it all. And God knows how to deal with it all. And I think we have to understand that God's always the one who's in control. And how does Hagar feel about all of this? Here she is being sent out again. And she knows this time if she's sent away, she's not coming back. It's not going to be okay. God's not going to pave the way for her. And she's got a son, and that's it. And she's given a loaf of bread and a skin of water. And where does she go? Well, she goes to the wilderness. And the good thing about the wilderness, it's the place where God sees. It's the place where you meet God. And so perhaps that's just where she goes. She goes to this wilderness, this desert area, and it is not really hospitable. Ours is very, very green, and you can see green even though this is one of the high times in the summer, and we've got to come out early just in order to do this so equipment doesn't seize up, because by later in the day it's going to be really, really hot, and the equipment doesn't even function out here in those times. And how could she function in those times? And it's just amazing to watch this story unfold.
Genesis 21:15. When the water of the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. And when she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin of the water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
And so Hagar is sent once again to the wilderness with her son this time. She has a skin of water and she has bread. And when the skin of water is gone, because it doesn't take very long for it to be gone, you get very thirsty. The air is very dry in the desert, and I'm sure that doesn't come across on the video, but most of you know about the desert and you know how dry it can be. In fact, when you're out here, you can't breathe through your mouth all the time, or else your mouth just turns to cotton because it's so dry. It kind of sucks all the moisture out of your system and out of you. And so you do have to be careful out here. And so she only has so much water. When the water runs out, what's she supposed to do? How's she going to handle this? Well, she puts her child under a bush, it says. Well, her child is not a little baby, remember. Her child is probably 16. And so she puts her child under a bush because she can't stand to watch him die. One of the things you have to realize about the desert also is that shade is a premium. I mean, shade is one of the most important things. It can feel 10 to 15 degrees hotter in the sun than it does in the shade. And so you've got a bush, and the sunny side of this bush is going to be so much hotter than the shady side of this bush. And so I think what he's talking about is he puts her son under a bush on the shady side of the bush where it's going to feel much cooler. It's the best she can do for him. It's the only thing she can do is be able to find shade. And it isn't actually that the sun or the air on this side of the bush is hotter than the air on this side of the bush. That's absolutely what it feels like. But when they tell you the temperature, they're telling you the temperature in the shade. And so it isn't the air that gets hotter, because air doesn't get hotter in shade than it does in sun. What happens is we get hotter, and the sun shines on us. And so then the sun reacts to us, and the sun feels 10 to 15 degrees hotter because it's making us 15 degrees hotter because it's shining on us. And so it is real. It is what it feels like, and it is actually what's happening because it's making us that much hotter than if we were sitting in the shade and it blocked the view of the sun. Well, that's important. We had this week a couple of people who are friends of ours who happened to bake cookies, and they brought some cookies by. Some of the cookies they baked on the dash of their truck. And I've always find that amazing. In Arizona, it does get hot. And through the windshield and on the dash of a truck, and you're letting them sit out there, sure enough, they baked. And it's just amazing. But it isn't that it makes the air that much hotter, it makes the cookie that much hotter. Maybe you're familiar with the magnifying glass and how if you focus it, it gets really intense and really hot and can even start a fire then. It gets really intense and really hot on us as well. That's why we're out here in the morning. It's supposed to be 108 today. That's in the shade. We're here in the morning where it's nice and cool and no problem at all. As you look at Sarai and her frustration with this whole situation, she thinks she has a solution by sending Hagar away. Hagar is not a solution for her. So she now has to go, and she's just alone in the wilderness. And she sits down far away from her child so that she doesn't have to watch him die. The angel comes to her and says, "What are you doing?" And she doesn't know. I'm out here because I have to be. It wasn't her choice. She didn't want to be out here. It's not what she thought of as doing, and so it's not what she's trying to do. It's she thought she was doing things right. It's just kind of a mess, isn't it? Have you ever been in those situations where you make a mess and it involves other people's lives and it gets really, really difficult? And the angel says, "Don't be afraid. I'm going to make him a great nation," and gives the promise that Abraham has his own promise, but that isn't all God is. God is able to deal with you as well. Because she had believed before, God is a God who sees, and now she recognizes the angel as he comes once again, and God is a God who sees, and he sees her. And the angel said, I've heard the cry of your boy. Okay, didn't he hear her cry? Because she was crying over what's going to happen. But he says, I've heard the cry of your boy. Maybe he's saying the prayer of your boy or the cry of distress of your boy, and God is going to rescue him. God is going to make of him a great nation because he's a child of Abraham, yeah, but also because God is God. It's who he is. It's what he does in situations when we can make horrible messes, and not just of our own, in our own life. We can make messes into other people's lives and cause them great distress and cause them great problems and great hurts. And it's one of the things that we may regret the most, is all of the things that we've said or done, or something that happened and we wish we would have handled it differently. But God is always there in those situations as well. And God is able to deal with it, and God's able to handle it. And so we see in this situation, he gives her the promise, and he gives her the sight to be able to see a well. Here's a well. And she's able to go and take the skin and fill it with water and take it to her son, and they're saved. God is able to save in the wilderness. And so while the wilderness may seem like a difficult place to live, a difficult time to deal with things, and we mess it up so much more, God sees in the wilderness, and God sees us, and God sees the mess we're in, and he may not fix the mess we're in, but God does see us. And he's able to rescue us, and he's able to make promises and make blessings. He's not going to take away somebody else's and give it to you. But understand, God may deal with you according to your faith. And he may allow those things to happen to you. And we can know that God is there and know that God does take care of us in those situations. And so while we may see everything as being a mess and horrible and life is essentially over, that we've given up, God doesn't see it that way. And maybe it's just he needs to give us sight to be able to see the relief, to be able to see where the water is, to be able to see the difficulty. And God is always able to rescue. And so we find ourselves in messes sometimes. And we thought we were trying to do right, and we thought we were trying to do good, and it just doesn't work that way. We thought we were being loving and caring, and it doesn't work that way. And sometimes we get jealous and we get mean. And sometimes we have to deal with people. And while we had the best intentions of everything, it turns out bad. And so what happens then? How do we deal with those things? Well, why didn't God just prevent it? Why didn't just God say, no, this is not going to happen? If Sarai doesn't get pregnant, then let's not let Hagar get pregnant either. And just solve it that way. You're going to have to wait, Abraham. You can't rush this. You're not going to be able to fix it. You just have to wait for me. But God doesn't do that, does he? Are you one of those people that's had a mess in your life? Maybe you've gotten past it. Maybe you haven't gotten past it. Maybe you still remember some of the mistakes that you made. Maybe you still remember that, we got in the way of other people and we caused great pain in their life and we caused difficulty and distress in their life. And we can hope that they'll forgive us. And it's something that just kind of eats away at us. And it becomes so difficult for us to deal with. And we all have regrets and rejection that we feel from others. At the same time, we may have done that to other people and given some reason for regret and other people to feel rejection. But what's the answer? How does this story help us in all of these situations? Well, I think the one thing in this story is that God sees in the wilderness. And it's not up to us to fix everything. And it's certainly not up to God to fix what we've made a mess of. And yet at the same time, God is able to bless at the right time. He doesn't take away the wilderness. He doesn't take away the fact that Hagar is sent out. He doesn't take away the injustice that's done to her. He also doesn't support the injustice that's done to her and say, yeah, this was terrible and awful and he never should have done this. Of course he never should have done this. That's not a question. And yet at the same time, he doesn't defend Abraham. He doesn't condemn Abraham. He just deals with where Hagar is. And he says, your child is going to be a child of promise. And so maybe the takeaway we get from this is we may have made a terrible mess in our life. And at some point been this horrible person, and we still have regrets and we still think back about it. But I want you to know God's able to bless all of it. We're able to get through it. And even if it seems like it's still wilderness, he's able to take the people of faith who are in that situation if they will just believe in him. And he's able to bless. And he's able to do great things. It's not going to be easy for Ishmael. He's going to have a difficult time. He already started out with a difficult time, and some of it his fault. Yeah, shouldn't have been teasing Isaac. Shouldn't have been, one place calls it persecuting Isaac. As you look in Galatians 4, it's another part of the story. And so you see that difficult decisions get made all the way through. But God is a God who sees. He's able to deal with it. He's able to bless. And in some of the harshest times in our life, when we feel like things are awful, it's not about fixing the injustice. It's about seeing God and realizing God sees us. And that's what's most important. This life is not going to be fair. It's not going to be just. It's not going to be the place that we want to be. And maybe that's a good thing. This life is a wilderness. And rejection and regret form a wilderness around us a lot of times. But there is a better place coming. A place where God has been able to give grace and where we are able to forgive and we are able to get past it all. And we are able to say we're all in the blessing of God. And that seems to make all the difference. When you think about sin and you think about forgiveness and you think about all the things that goes on, it can be difficult. The jealousy can be very hard to get past. And yet, when we see the grace of God being given to every single person around us, maybe that helps us realize how God deals with things. Because he is a God of grace. And he is a God who takes care of people when they believe. The other thing I want you to realize is that even though we may have not dealt with things right, even though we may have sinned and done it wrong and said the wrong thing and had the wrong action and done something that they may never forgive us for, or they at least may never get over. They may forgive us. We've got to realize that God's able to help and that God's able to deal with that. And that we look forward. We don't just look back at all the sin. That's Satan's perfect trick, isn't it? Why don't I make you feel guilty about everything you've ever done in your life? No. Why don't you let the angel say to you, why are you out here? What is it you're afraid of? Don't you know we have a God who blesses? Don't you know we have a God who sees your situation? And let's just rejoice in the situation we have and not worry about the rest of it. When we can find the grace of God and when we can find where God meets us in the wilderness, then we are able to have his grace and his mercy. And by the time we all get to heaven, it's going to be a place of grace and mercy. And the rest of it, it just needs to all fade away. It isn't dealt with. God doesn't fix it. But it all fades away. This is a story about how God sees in the wilderness.